blood on the sterile floor of a civilian ER is nothing compared to the crimson-soaked sand of the Korengal Valley. When a hotshot trauma surgeon publicly humiliated the quiet new nurse, he thought he was putting a timid rookie in her place. He had absolutely no idea he had just crossed a Tier 1 combat medic. The emergency department at Seattle Memorial was a relentless, pulsating beast. It was a Level 1 trauma center that thrived on controlled chaos, a place where the scent of iodine and iron hung heavy in the air, punctuated by the relentless, staccato rhythm of cardiac monitors. For most nurses, surviving a shift here was a badge of honor. For Elena Vance, it was practically a vacation. Elena stood by the trauma bay sinks, washing her hands with meticulous, rhythmic precision. She was 32, with sharp, observant green eyes and dark hair pulled back into a severe, utilitarian bun. To the rest of the staff, she was simply the new hire, a quiet, unassuming RN who had transferred in from somewhere out of state and kept her head down. She didn't participate in the break room gossip, she didn't complain about the back-to-back 12-hour shifts, and she certainly didn't boast about her past. Her past, however, was written in the subtle, faded scars on her forearms and the way her eyes constantly scanned the room for exits and improvised tourniquets. Before putting on the navy blue scrubs of Seattle Memorial, Elena had worn OCPs. She had been attached to a highly classified Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC task force, operating in environments where a trauma bay was the dusty back of an MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter flying evasive maneuvers under heavy RPG fire. She had packed wounds in pitch blackness, performed emergency cricothyrotomies in thigh-deep mud, and kept catastrophically wounded operators alive for days when medical evacuations were impossible. But here, she was just the new girl. The double doors of the trauma bay crashed open, shattering the momentary lull. Paramedics barreled in, pushing a gurney that left a trail of red droplets on the pristine linoleum. Male, mid-40s, industrial accident. Paramedic David shouted over the din, out of breath. Crush injury to the lower right extremity. Massive hemorrhage. Vitals are crashing. BP is 80/50. Heart rate 130. Enter Dr. Marcus Thorne. Dr. Thorne was the undisputed king of the Seattle Memorial ER. Brilliant, handsome, and impeccably educated at Johns Hopkins, he possessed a diagnostic mind that was matched only by his gargantuan ego. He moved with the swagger of a man who believed the sun rose and set on his medical license. He demanded perfection, and he was notoriously merciless to anyone who failed to meet his impossible standards. "Transfer him on 3, Thorne barked, not even glancing at the paramedics. 1, 2, 3. The patient, a construction worker named Arthur, groaned in agony as he was shifted onto the hospital bed. His right leg was a mangled mess of denim, bone, and torn muscle. Elena moved instantly. While the other nurses were still reacting to the sight of the gruesome injury, her muscle memory took over. In her mind, she wasn't in a brightly lit hospital. She was running through the trauma algorithms that had been beaten into her during the grueling Special Operations Combat Medic course at Fort Bragg. Massive hemorrhage, airway, respiration, circulation, hypothermia. She stepped to the foot of the bed, her hands flying over the patient's ruined leg, seeking the source of the arterial bleed. "Who the hell told you to touch my patient?" Thorne's voice cut through the room like a whip. Elena paused, her hands slick with Arthur's blood, and looked up. "Doctor, he has an active arterial bleed from a lacerated femoral. The field tourniquet is slipping." "I have eyes." Nurse Thorne glanced at her badge. "Vance. I don't need a play-by-play from a junior floor nurse. Get out of my way. Jenkins, get me a trauma line, push a liter of saline, and prep for an immediate intubation. The shock is going to crash his airway." Head nurse Sarah Jenkins scrambled to comply, but Elena didn't step back. The field tourniquet, applied hastily by the paramedics, was indeed failing. Blood was beginning to pool beneath Arthur's hip. Pushing saline before stopping the bleed would only dilute his remaining clotting factors and accelerate his death. "Dr. Thorne," Elena said, her voice eerily calm, devoid of the panic he was accustomed to hearing from subordinates. "If we push fluids before achieving hemorrhage control, we'll wash out his platelets. I need to apply a secondary, high and tight tourniquet right now." The entire trauma bay fell dead silent. Even the rhythmic beeping of the monitor seemed to hold its breath. Nurses didn't question Dr. Thorne. They certainly didn't instruct him on trauma protocols in the middle of a code. Thorne's face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. He stepped away from the head of the bed, stalking toward Elena. He towered over her, his eyes blazing with fury. "Let me make something abundantly clear to you, Vance," Thorne hissed, loud enough for everyone in the bay to hear. "You are not at some sleepy suburban clinic anymore, sweetheart. This is a level 1 trauma center. I am the attending physician. You are a registered nurse who probably gets squeamish when a paper cut bleeds. You don't diagnose, you don't dictate treatment, and you absolutely do not ever question my orders. Do you understand me?" Elena stared back at him. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply looked at him with the cold, detached assessment of someone sizing up a threat. In her head, she compared him to the arrogant, freshly minted lieutenants she had dealt with in the military men whose pride often got people killed. Without breaking eye contact, Elena's right hand moved with blinding speed. She unclipped a fresh cat tourniquet from her scrubs, a habit she hadn't broken since her deployment, slipped it high over Arthur's thigh, and cranked the windlass down tight, securing the time strap. The pooling blood stopped instantly. "Hemostasis achieved," Elena stated flatly. She then stepped back, holding up her bloody, gloved hands. "I'll go fetch those warm blankets you clearly need, doctor." Thorne was apoplectic. The fact that she was right, the bleeding had stopped entirely, only fueled his rage. "Get out!" he roared. "Get out of my trauma bay! Jenkins, write her up for insubordination!" Elena turned on her heel and walked out of the bay, the automatic doors sealing shut behind her. She didn't go to the break room to cry. She went to the sinks, washed her hands with the same meticulous precision as before, and grabbed a fresh pair of gloves. Word of the confrontation spread through the hospital faster than a staph infection. By the end of her shift, Elena was the subject of intense whispers at every nurse's station. Head nurse Sarah Jenkins, a 20-year veteran of the ER with a weary but kind face, pulled Elena aside in the supply closet later that afternoon. "Look, Elena," Sarah sighed, leaning against a shelf of saline bags. "You're a good nurse. I can see that. You've got good hands. But Dr. Thorne, he's untouchable. He's the golden boy of the hospital administration. He brings in the grants. He does the high-profile surgeries. If you cross him, he will make your life a living hell until you quit." "I was doing my job, Sarah," Elena replied softly, organizing a tray of IV catheters. The patient was bleeding out. "I know," Sarah said, rubbing her temples. "But Thorne needs to be the hero. He needs to be the smartest guy in the room. You wounded his pride. Just keep your head down, okay? Don't give him an excuse to fire you." Elena nodded, though internally she felt a familiar, cold resignation. Pride. It was the enemy of good medicine. She had seen pride result in body bags in Fallujah. She wasn't about to let it kill civilians in Seattle. For the next 2 weeks, Thorne made good on his unspoken threat. He assigned Elena the absolute worst tasks in the department. She was relegated to cleaning bedpans, dealing with aggressive, intoxicated patients in the waiting room, and stocking the medical supply closets in the basement. Whenever she was forced to assist him on a minor case, he went out of his way to belittle her, snapping at her for handing him instruments a fraction of a second too late, or mocking her quiet demeanor as ignorance. "Wake up, Vance!" he would sneer as she handed him sutures for a superficial laceration. "We're actually trying to save lives here, not just stand around looking confused." Elena took the abuse with a stoicism that frankly unnerved the rest of the staff. She never argued back, she never broke down, she just watched him with those piercing green eyes. But beneath the surface, Elena's elite skills were quietly leaking out, saving lives in the shadows where Thorne couldn't see. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. A young woman, barely 19, was brought in complaining of severe abdominal pain after a minor fender bender. The initial scans were clean, and Dr. Thorne, eager to clear beds, had diagnosed her with a bruised rib and ordered her discharge. Elena was tasked with removing the girl's IV. As she approached the bed, her trained eyes noticed the micro-expressions of agony on the girl's face. The monitors showed normal vitals, but Elena noticed something else, a faint, almost imperceptible bluish discoloration around the girl's umbilicus, Cullen's sign. Elena casually placed 2 fingers on the girl's wrist. Her radial pulse was thready, much weaker than the monitor's rhythmic beep suggested. She was entering the early stages of compensated hypovolemic shock. She was bleeding internally, likely a slow-leaking, ruptured spleen that the initial rapid scan had missed. Elena knew if she went to Thorne, He would dismiss her and discharge the girl, likely sending her home to die in her sleep. Instead, Elena quietly flagged down Dr. Chloe Evans, a brilliant but overworked second-year resident who was terrified of Thorne but genuinely cared about patients. "Dr. Evans," Elena whispered, pulling her into an alcove. "Bed 4. I was just taking her vitals. She's complaining of left shoulder pain, CARES sign. And I noticed some periumbilical ecchymosis. Her pulse pressure is narrowing." Chloe frowned, looking at her tablet. Thorne cleared her. He said it was just a contusion. "Look at her, doctor," Elena urged gently. "Really look at her." Chloe walked over, did a quick secondary assessment, and her eyes widened. She immediately ordered a stat abdominal CT with contrast. 10 minutes later, the girl was being rushed to emergency surgery for a grade 3 splenic laceration. When Thorne found out, he swaggered into the nurse's station, loudly praising Dr. Evans for her astute clinical catch and patting himself on the back for training his residents so well. Chloe looked at Elena, guilt flashing in her eyes, but Elena just gave her a microscopic nod, silencing her. Elena didn't care about the credit. She only cared that the girl was alive. But the real test, the event that would shatter Dr. Marcus Thorne's illusion of control and reveal exactly who Elena Vance was rapidly approaching. It was a Friday evening, just past 6 p.m. The ER was already nearing capacity, with the usual weekend influx of traumas, drug overdoses, and domestic disputes. The rain was coming down in sheets, hammering against the reinforced glass windows of the waiting room. Elena was in trauma bay too, restocking the intubation kits, when the air in the hospital seemed to suddenly shift. It was a tangible change in atmospheric pressure, followed immediately by a low, rumbling vibration that rattled the surgical instruments on their metal trays. A split second later, a dull boom echoed through the city, shaking the very foundations of Seattle Memorial. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence in the ER. Then, every single red trauma phone in the department began to ring simultaneously. It was a shrill, terrifying sound that most civilian nurses had never heard in unison. Sarah Jenkins snatched up the receiver at the main desk. She listened for 5 seconds, her face draining of all color. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering against the counter. She slammed her hand down on the large red button on the wall. The hospital's overhead PA system crackled to life, accompanied by a harsh, flashing strobe light. Code triage. Code triage. Mass casualty incident. All available personnel report to the emergency department immediately. Thorne stepped out of his office, his coffee mug in hand, a slight frown creasing his brow. "Jenkins, what is it? A bus crash?" "No," Sarah breathed, her voice trembling. The chemical processing plant on the industrial west side, the main reactor, exploded, the structural collapse. It took out an adjacent apartment complex and trapped the night shift workers. Thorne puffed out his chest, stepping into the center of the room. "All right, listen up," he yelled, clapping his hands. "Clear the bays! Discharge anyone who can walk. We've trained for this. We stick to triage protocols. It's just a bigger scale, people." But Thorne had never seen war. He had run drills with simulated patients and fake blood. He had read textbooks on disaster management. 10 minutes later, the first wave arrived, and the doors of the ER blew open like the gates of hell. Ambulances screeched to a halt, 3 at a time. Fire rescue trucks, police cruisers, and even civilian pickup trucks began dumping bodies at the entrance. The screams hit them first, a horrifying cacophony of agony, terror, and chaos. Victims were covered in a toxic mixture of concrete dust, chemical slurry, and blood. The sheer volume of trauma was apocalyptic. There were severe burn victims, crush injuries, traumatic amputations, and people choking on chemical fumes. Thorne stood at the triage desk, staring as 30 critically injured patients were rolled in within the span of 3 minutes. His eyes darted from a man holding his own eviscerated intestines to a woman with severe third-degree chemical burns screaming for her child. The monitors were all blaring, the nurses were shouting for orders, and the blood was pooling on the floor so fast it looked like a red tide. The math of the situation slammed into Thorne's brain. 30 criticals, 4 trauma bays, 1 attending. The civilian algorithms he relied on collapsed under the weight of the impossibility. For the first time in his spectacular, ego-driven career, Dr. Marcus Thorne froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The god of the ER was utterly paralyzed by the overwhelming reality of mass human destruction. A paramedic was screaming at him, Doc, I need a chest tube here. He's tensioning. Doc! Thorne blinked, his hands trembling as he stared at the dying man. He couldn't move. Suddenly, a hand firm, steady, and clad in a purple nitrile glove pushed past him. I've got him. A calm, commanding voice sliced through the hysteria. Thorne snapped out of his daze and looked to his right. Elena Vance stood there. But she didn't look like the quiet, submissive floor nurse he had been tormenting for weeks. Her posture had completely transformed. Her eyes were hard as flint, calculating, and completely devoid of fear. She was radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying competence. She had stepped back into the war zone, and she was about to take command. Elena didn't wait for Dr. Thorne's permission. She snatched a 1-4 gauge angiocatheter from the paralyzed paramedic's hand and slammed it directly into the second intercostal space of the dying man's chest. A sharp, audible hiss of trapped air erupted from the needle hub. The patient's oxygen saturations, previously plummeting into the low 70s, immediately began to climb. Tension pneumothorax relieved, Elena announced, her voice projecting across the chaotic room with a booming, unnatural calm. It wasn't a yell, it was a command voice, honed on the explosive battlefields of Kandahar. She turned her back on Thorne and faced the stunned room. Listen to me! Elena's voice cracked like a rifle shot, cutting through the wailing patients and blaring alarms. Every nurse, resident, and orderly froze, locking eyes with the new nurse. Civilian triage is dead. As of right now, we are in military mass call protocol. Sarah, I want 4 colored tarps taped to the floor of the ambulance bay right now. Red, yellow, green, black. Move. Sarah Jenkins blinked, shock momentarily stalling her. But hospital policy didn't account for a chemical plant detonating in a residential zone, Elena snapped, moving to the next crashing patient. Green is walking wounded. Push them to the cafeteria. Get them out of our way. Yellow is delayed. Stage them in the hallways. Red is immediate. They go into the bays. Black is expectant. If they have non-survivable injuries, you give them morphine and move on. We do not waste resources on the dead when the living are bleeding out. Go. The absolute authority in her voice broke the spell of panic. Sarah bolted for the supply closet. Dr. Chloe Evans, the young resident, ran to Elena's side, her hands shaking. What do you need me to do, Vance? Chloe asked, her voice tight with fear. You are on airway control, Chloe, Elena commanded, pointing to a row of stretchers. If they can't breathe, tube them. If you can't tube them, crick them. Do not hesitate. Thorne finally seemed to thaw from his paralytic shock, his face flushed with a sudden, defensive rage. Vance! What the hell do you think you're doing? I am the attending physician. You do not dictate triage in my hospital. Elena turned slowly, her green eyes locking onto Thorne with a terrifying, predatory intensity. She closed the distance between them in 2 strides, stepping inside his personal space. Marcus, she said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that only he could hear. You are drowning. Look around you. You have never seen a mass casualty event in your life. I have seen 50. You have 2 choices right now. You can either let your ego kill these people and answer to the medical board tomorrow, or you can pick up a scalpel, get to Trauma Bay 1, and do exactly what I tell you to do. Choose. Thorne opened his mouth to scream at her, to fire her on the spot. But he looked into her eyes. There was no defiance there, no insubordination. There was only the cold, mechanical calculus of a seasoned combat veteran who had weighed his worth and found him lacking. He swallowed hard, the reality of the blood-soaked room breaking his pride. Bay 1, Thorne muttered, turning and practically fleeing toward the surgical tray. For the next 6 hours, Elena Vance did not stop moving. She was a maestro conducting a symphony of survival, her mind processing 1,000 horrific variables a second. She orchestrated the flow of 34 critical patients with terrifying efficiency. She didn't just nurse, she performed emergency field medicine that left the civilian staff utterly breathless. When a man with a shattered pelvis began bleeding out internally and no surgeons were available, Elena calmly directed Thorne through a Reboa procedure, resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta, a highly advanced, incredibly risky military trauma maneuver, rarely seen outside of a war zone. Thread the catheter, Marcus, she instructed, her hands steadying his shaking ones. Inflate the balloon in zone 1, cut off the blood supply to his lower half, or he bleeds out in 60 seconds. Thorne, sweating profusely, followed her exact commands. The bleeding stopped. The patient stabilized. Thorne looked up at her, utterly bewildered, but Elena had already moved on. At hour 4, a new patient was rolled in by emergency responders. He was a private security contractor who had been guarding the chemical plant, a massive man covered in second-degree chemical burns and shrapnel wounds. Elena knelt beside his stretcher, shining a penlight into his dilated pupils. "Sir, I need to check your airway for inhalation burns." The burly contractor squinted through the blood and soot covering his face. His eyes widened in disbelief. "Doc? Doc Vance? Is that you?" Elena paused, her expression unreadable. "Keep still. Your heart rate is tachycardic." "I'll be damned!" the contractor coughed, a bloody smile spreading across his face. "Jackson, 3rd Ranger Battalion. You pulled me out of a burning striker in the Korengal Valley in 18. You're Archangel. What the hell are you doing in a civilian scrub suit?" Dr. Chloe Evans, who was prepping an IV line next to them, stopped dead. "Archangel?" she whispered, looking at Elena. "Ranger Battalion? Stay with us, Jackson," Elena said softly, ignoring Chloe. She tapped his shoulder, a uniquely military gesture of comfort. "You're not dying on my watch today either. Push 4 milligrams of Dilaudid, Chloe. Now." By 4 a.m., the storm had finally broken. The ER looked like the aftermath of a bombing. The linoleum was stained a dull, rusty brown. Discarded wrappers, bloody gauze, and empty saline bags littered the floor. But the screams had stopped. The patients were either in the ICU, in emergency surgery, or stabilized for transport. Dr. Marcus Thorne sat on a rolling stool in the supply room, staring blankly at the wall. His scrubs were soaked in blood. His hands, usually so steady, were trembling with exhaustion. His mind was playing the night on a continuous loop. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that if it hadn't been for the nurse he had relentlessly mocked for the past month, at least a dozen people would have died tonight, including the man whose aorta he had ballooned. The double doors of the ER suddenly slid open, admitting a fresh wave of authoritative figures. But these weren't paramedics. They were military personnel in dress uniforms and federal disaster response jackets. Leading them was a tall, imposing man with graying temples, wearing the silver eagles of an Army colonel. Colonel David Reed, the commanding medical officer for the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, flanked by 2 aides, surveyed the absolute carnage of the civilian ER. He had been dispatched to coordinate the medevac of several DoD contractors injured in the chemical blast. Thorne, seeing the military brass, forced himself to stand. He wiped his bloody face with his forearm and walked out of the supply room to intercept them, assuming they were looking for the attending physician. "Colonel," Thorne croaked, his voice hoarse. "I'm Dr. Marcus Thorne, the attending trauma surgeon. We've managed to stabilize the influx, but we need." Colonel Reed completely ignored Thorne's outstretched hand. His eyes had locked onto a figure standing by the trauma sinks. Elena was washing her hands. The rhythmic, meticulous scrubbing was exactly the same as her first day. "I don't believe it," Colonel Reed said, his stern face breaking into a massive, deeply respectful smile. He walked right past Thorne. "They told me you retired to the Pacific Northwest to get away from the adrenaline. Yet here I find you, knee-deep in the worst mass call this state has seen in a decade." Elena turned off the faucet, dried her hands, and turned around. She offered a tired, genuine smile. "Hello, David. Chaos just seems to find me." Thorne stood frozen, his arms still awkwardly extended. "Colonel, you know Nurse Vance?" Reed turned to Thorne, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Nurse Vance?" Reed let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Doctor, is that what she told you? Jesus, Elena, your modesty is going to get you in trouble one of these days." Reed turned fully toward Thorne, his posture straightening into that of a commanding officer. "Dr. Thorne, allow me to introduce you to Captain Elena Vance, United States Army, formerly the lead field surgeon and elite Tier 1 combat medic for JSOC's premier counter-terrorism task force. She holds the Silver Star for gallantry in action, and she literally wrote the Department of Defense's Advanced Trauma Life Support Protocols, the same protocols your civilian hospitals adopted 3 years ago." The blood completely drained from Thorne's face. He felt like the floor had just vanished beneath his feet. He looked at Elena, the quiet, unassuming woman he had ordered to empty bedpans. The woman he had accused of being squeamish over a paper cut. She was a decorated war hero. She had operated under enemy fire. She was practically medical royalty. "You, Thorne stammered, his immense ego shattering into a million irreparable pieces. You're a captain? You wrote the Reboa protocols? I was a captain, Elena corrected softly. I left the service because I wanted a quiet life, Marcus. I just wanted to help people without getting shot at. She is the single finest trauma specialist I have ever seen in a combat theater, Colonel Reed added, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. We called her Archangel, because if she touched you, you didn't die. I'm assuming she saved your ass tonight, Doctor? Thorne couldn't even formulate a lie. The humiliation was total, but beneath it, a strange, unfamiliar sense of humility washed over him. He looked around the ER. He looked at the empty body bags that would have been full if not for her. Thorne walked slowly over to Elena. The entire remaining night shift staff, Sarah, Chloe, and a dozen others were watching in stunned silence. Thorne stopped a few feet from her. He didn't look down at her. He looked her dead in the eye. You were right, Thorne said, his voice cracking. It was the hardest thing he had ever said in his life. About the tourniquet on your first day, about the massive hemorrhage protocols tonight, about me. He swallowed, dropping his gaze for a fraction of a second before meeting hers again. I froze tonight. You didn't. Thank you, Captain. Elena studied him for a long moment. She didn't gloat. She didn't demand an apology for the weeks of abuse. That wasn't who she was. She was a professional. We saved them together, Marcus, Elena said quietly, tossing her used paper towel into the biohazard bin. Now, if you don't mind, Bed 4 needs a dressing change, and I'm still on the clock for another hour. She walked past the colonel, past the devastated surgeon, and back out onto the floor. The elite combat medic didn't need the glory. She just needed the next patient. Elena's story proves that true leadership and elite skill don't need to boast, they reveal themselves when the pressure is highest. Never underestimate the quiet ones. You never know what kind of battles they've already survived. If this intense medical drama kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves an incredible underdog story. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired stories.